In this segment of income distribution and inequality, I'd like to start to take a look at some income inequality statistics. Hopefully this will be in an order that helps build on some concepts for you. I'm certainly attempting to do that, but we're simply going to take a look at some graphics that will help us kind of frame the trends and the direction of income inequality within our country, and let us see something about the significance of these changes and help you maybe understand why I'm saying that maybe things are coming to an apex or an inflection, which will yield some meaningful change at some point in the not too distant future. These are not all of the different statistics that we could be looking at by any means, but they are some interesting ones that I thought would help you understand and frame this issue, if you will. So first, let's consider the changing income gap. In the green line here, we get to see some level of inequality or share of income going to the top 10%. We're going back as far as 1918 here, and then we move forward to 2008. Income inequality has not changed meaningfully in the last 7 or 8 years. It has continued on its course, albeit at a slowing pace, which causes some of us to think once again that we might be reaching or nearing an apex. Or maybe we have reached an apex and that change is forthcoming. So if we look at this, the top 10% of our population, or our households, received in 1918 approximately 40% of the income in our economy. That peaked out at about 43% in the early 1930s, just before the Great Depression, and then the Depression caused that to plummet dramatically and caused a great equalizing of the income and wealth classes, if you will. We see that equalization take place sometimes through exogenous change, like a depression, but sometimes we see it just change organically, and that's a more peaceable change. That's a change that is accompanied by far less pain than a depression would give us. But then we see that income inequality, or the income gap, begin to widen in the late 1960s and 70s, and by 1980 we see that this gap has been widening again rather aggressively, and post-1980 we see that the income inequality, or the income gap, is widening dramatically, such that we're now back to where the top 10% within our economy are at 45% of income for the economy, 57% of income for the economy, and today we are approaching 60% of the total income on our economy held by the upper income class, the top 10%. It's interesting. If you hearken back to our discussion on labor unions in a prior module, you can see that this trend line of increasing income being accumulated or concentrated on the top 10% is directly related to the density of union activity. When we see that high income concentration amongst the top 10%, we see a low density of labor union activity. When we see increasing union activity or density, we see decreasing top 10% income accumulation, and so forth. This is an interesting relationship. The overall trend in our economy probably won't surprise you. We look here at 1967 through 2002, and the trend of 2002 and beyond has simply continued. And we see that the top 5% had come relatively close to the percentage of the income held by the bottom 40% within our society. But now the top 5% has been steadily growing since about 1980, and we see that that this growth is, while not unchecked perhaps, certainly problematic. And we see that that the top 5% is accumulating wealth at a higher pace. They're being attributed income at a higher pace, but the bottom 40% is declining in their shares of income. They're not just declining in their shares of nominal income. We find that they actually have stagnated or declined in their real income attributes as well. If I could carry on these graphics or these trend lines back in time, say even into the 1800s, we would see they actually went along like this. Now my trend lines are intended to show that it's not been a smooth or an even transition. So the ups and the downs are simply representative. They're not detailed at all. But we would also see that the bottom quartile, the bottom 40% rather, was seeing an improvement up through the 1960s, 70s, and then begin to devolve after 1980. We see that the upper part of the income spectrum was devolving in these years as we were coming into what we know as the golden age of capital in the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s. And that we broke out of that in about 1980. Perhaps it's important to talk about why we broke out of that. We represented this a little bit within the labor union discussion as we talked about President Reagan, as we talked about pressures on different parts of society, and we found that in the labor markets that we saw a tremendous reflection of this pressure. Think about the 1960s and 70s. We had the civil rights movement. We were in the Vietnam War. We had the upper income part of our economy paid 70 and 80% top marginal tax brackets. We had several assassinations. President Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. All of these were very transformative social figures, political figures, but this was a very transformative social and political time. There was a tremendous amount of unrest in the upper income spectrum of society. There was a tremendous amount of unrest in the lower income spectrum of society. And when you see that kind of unrest in both ends of society, change occurs. We had the Watts riots. We were just coming off of the formation of President Johnson's Great Society. There was a tremendous amount going on. The flower children had occupied, if you will, the Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco in the early to mid-1960s. By 1970, the flower children and those seeking peace and love had pretty much left the area, and it had become denizens for drug dealing and prostitution and some of the early elements of gang violence within the San Francisco Bay Area. So tremendous unrest, tremendous movement within society, and we saw then an inflection point. We saw that we changed trend lines. We were headed decidedly in a more egalitarian trend to that point, and after that point, a decidedly less egalitarian trend. Well, here we get to see the bottom 90%, the top 10 to 1%, so not the top 1%, but percentages 1 to 10, then the top 1/2 to 1%, and then the top 1/2%. And then we get to see their wealth distribution between 1960 and 2012 in percentages here as we move through time. Well, not surprisingly, the top 1/2% of our economy was somewhat constant and has grown at a fairly significant pace, going from just over 22% to almost 35%. This is the top 1/2% of our income earners within our society. The top 1 to 10%, so that 9% in there has gone from 45% down to approximately 35%. So the real problem we're seeing here isn't the top 10% as a whole, but you'll see that it really is the top 1/2%, because the 1/2 to 1% has been relatively flat at about 6, 7, 8% of our economy. And the bottom percent, well, in 1960, we were about 27%, reached an apex just after 1982, or just after 1980 at about 36%, and has been steadily in decline to where in 2012 we saw this at just over 25%. We now are below 25%. So again, this is a story really of the top 1/2% and the bottom 90%, or very acutely the bottom 40%. This, by the way, was wealth inequality. I erred when I referenced incomes here. These weren't incomes earners. This is wealth accumulation, excuse me. And again, wealth accumulation, the accumulation of surplus profit, is the very backbone and formation of capitalism. So as we think about distribution in incomes for some of these same years, we're moving from 1970 through 2010, 2012, and we're seeing negative changes and we're seeing positive changes. And we see in the early parts of this period, 1967 through about 1982, 84, in here we saw relative consistency, although we did see the fourth 20 percentile decreasing, the fourth 20 percentile being the next to the bottom. And this is in quintiles that we're measuring this, so we've looked at most of this by taking the entire economy and separating it into 5 equal parts. The top 20%, the second 20%, the third 20%, the fourth 20%, and then finally the bottom 20%, the lowest income earners within our society. And in this graphic, we also separate out the top 5%, just motivating or retelling the story I told in the prior graphic, that this really is a discussion of the lower portions of the income distribution compared to not just the top 10%, but really the top 1/2 or 1% here encapsulated in this top 5%. As these areas of society have decreased in their share of overall income, going from a normalized convergence to a rather broad divergence, we see that their changes have been significant in these years. So as we look again further at some inequality statistics, we're looking here at real median household incomes ranging from $47,000 to $57,000 on our y-axis. We're looking at time here, 1980 through 2015, and this is real income. This is inflation adjusted. So we're actually looking at the 2011 CPIU inflation adjustment here, and we see that this is median income. It's probably important for us to point out at the moment the difference between median income and average income. Average income would be just the average income of all workers or earners within society, whereas the median income would be the income of that household or that worker that sits right in the middle. So we might have a very attractive average income, but when we look at the median income, it may be much less attractive. So we think about median incomes when we think about inequalities, and when we think about very objective or functional distributions. It tells us something about the plight of the average man rather than the average income, which could be heavily influenced if we had 1, 2, or 5% of the earners at the top with significant parts of income, and all others where they really didn't have much income at all. The average might look great, but the median would tell the more accurate story. So here we see in about 1984 that the median income began at just over $47,000. We did see some real median income increases, so some inflation-adjusted increases as we moved through the 1980s and then as we moved into the mid-1990s. We did see this downward correction here. This is going to be a period of higher inflation. We saw low inflation and good growth, real per capita GDP growth, real median household income growth through about 1996, 97, and then we saw the real median income begin to dip. This was dipping as we went through the dot-com bubble, and as many households had incomes that were disrupted through that, had asset values, stock portfolio values disrupted. But then we saw a great improvement in that in the mid-2000s as the housing bubble began to form and as people began to see real incomes through great economic activity in our society because of the housing market, construction, durable goods, etc. But this is also as we're looking at the effect of some pretty significant changes or increases in globalization. But as we saw that housing bubble burst and we saw the incomes that were generated from it start to erode and disappear, we see a tremendous decrease such that we're back to about the same levels of real income, median real income that we were in 1989. for most households. That's not good news, by the way. In fact, this is not simply during that recession. The recessions are marked by our gray bars within this graphic. This isn't simply during the recession. This is after the recession. This is in the midst of what has been a worthwhile economic recovery. Even within that, median household incomes have gone backwards, and they've gone backwards dramatically. We can see something that Thomas Piketty and that Paul Krugman and then also Robert Reich, who you'll hear about in Inequality for All, talk about as being almost a Golden Gate Bridge kind of structure, where we have the piers and the pilings of the bridge on either end, and we have the spans going across the middle. And we see that the top 10% of richest Americans share of the economy has really kind of looks like this bridge and span configuration. Here we saw some figures, and this again isn't surprising to you from what we've already looked at, but we see that the top 10% reached about 50%, just under 50% of all of the economy, or the income in the economy. This is before World War II. This is before the Depression, so this is coming into World War I. That began to erode because of World War I. War is a great destroyer of incomes and assets, and it destroys, more tragically than anything else, the human capital asset. But we see that it destroys, but it's also a great equalizer in a very tragic way. And so we then see the Depression, and then we see World War II. And so we see the share of the richest part of our society, their share of overall income plummet. And then it stayed relatively constant for a number of years. We had the Korean conflict. We had the Vietnam era conflict. And then we see about 1980, we see the Reagan era, and we see this structural break, this inflection point break. The Depression formed an inflection point, a structural break. The World War II reinforced that inflection and structural break. We saw another one as we began to get beyond this relatively low level of income inequality, and income inequality has done nothing but increase over time. Now, certainly we've had a couple of periods where it's been difficult. This is following the dot-com bubble burst in 2000. This is the peak of the housing market bubble and how it burst. But then if we look at this for 2009, 10 through 15, we see the trend line starting to come back up here, as one might expect it to. This is interesting. We often hear people say, well, income inequality is only significant because the upper income classes get so much of their functional income through capital gains, so selling of investment assets that yield them great profits. Well, as we look here, we can see the top 10% in income share on the y-axis. We get to go from 1917 to 2007 in the x-axis, and the red line is inequality and income differences, including capital gains, and the blue line is excluding capital gains. So you see in reality that these trend lines really give us our same bridge and span structure as we've seen before, but that these lines are precious little difference when we include capital gains. They're always a little bit higher, of course, as you would expect them to be intuitively, but they're very little different when we include capital gains, suggesting this really is an issue of incomes generally, not just of profits from long-term asset transactions. And then finally, as we consider inequality statistics, we are looking at the top 10% and the bottom 10% again, or excuse me, the top 10% and the bottom 90%. This looks much alike the first graphic that we looked at, but that first graphic was looking at changes in income gap as a function of changes in union density. Here we see just the opposite relationship, where the top 90% or 10% is in the bottom here in terms of their share of total income in the span period, but the bottom 9% is in the top. And this is simply telling us, the way this graphic is structured, that the bottom 90% of society really did improve in terms of their income utility, their discretionary income utility during these years. And remember that these years, bounding about here, is the golden age of capitalism. This is where firms had the greatest profits. This is where households saw the greatest increases in real income. This is where firms saw the greatest changes in productivity. And this is where we see that unions certainly had become strong, but also firms became very strong. So strong as to force the inflection changes in 1980 that have yielded some of the problems that we're dealing with today and have continued to have the influence to change those. But what we're seeing here is a period of great prosperity, both for households as well as for firms. It's interesting, in the film Inequality for All that you'll see towards the end of this module, Robert Reich, a noted economist, albeit somewhat leftist, but having served under both a Republican and a Democrat administration, a presidential administration, if I recall correctly, Rice tells us if we want to consider the economy that we should try to model ours after today, we don't need to look very far. We simply need to look back to this period in our nation's history. This is the economic time to model ourselves after. And it's really kind of an interesting tell, if you will, on the state of our society and what we have maybe devolved to today.